Welcome to the sinister side. Before we begin, pause for a second and tell me this. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Because tonight's story feels different depending on when and where you hear it. Imagine a place everyone thought they understood, a place that looked ordinary in daylight, respectable even. But beneath that calm surface, something was hidden so dangerous that a single sound could have ended dozens of lives. This is not a story about loud rebellion or open defiance. It's about silence, about patience, about a secret so carefully buried that history almost erased it completely. In the year 1850, in the heart of the American South, a woman lived alone on land built by cruelty. People feared her for reasons they could never explain. They sensed something was wrong, but no one dared to look closer. And the truth, if it had been discovered, would have shocked an entire nation. Tonight, on the sinister side, we're uncovering a story that asks one haunting question. What kind of secret could survive for years in the most dangerous place imaginable without anyone ever proving it existed? Stay with me. Listen carefully. Because this story only reveals itself to those who are willing to sit in the darkness until the very end. In 1850, the American South lived under a constant suffocating weight of fear, a fear so normal that most people stop noticing it, the way one stops noticing the air until it is suddenly gone. The plantations looked calm from the outside, stretching endlessly beneath the sun, their white houses standing tall like symbols of order and tradition. But beneath that appearance was a world ruled by violence, control, and an unspoken agreement that certain lives mattered less than others. Slavery was not just a system of labor, it was a system of terror, maintained by laws, whips, patrols, and silence. Every road, every town, every farm was connected by the same understanding. Anyone who challenged this order would be crushed without mercy. The year itself made everything worse. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act turned paranoia into policy. It declared that no place in America was truly safe for an escaped slave, not even the so-called free states. It empowered ordinary citizens to become hunters, rewarded betrayal with money, and punished compassion as a crime. A person could be fined or imprisoned simply for offering food, shelter, or silence to someone fleeing bondage. This law did not just target runaway slaves, it targeted humanity itself. It taught people to look away, to close their doors, and to convince themselves that cruelty was simply the way the world worked. In the Deep South, especially in Alabama, the law's shadow was long and dark. Slave patrols rode at night, their lanterns cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. Dogs were trained to follow the scent of fear. Notices were posted in towns describing escaped men and women as if they were livestock, listing scars, missing fingers, brands, and prices for their capture. Every stranger was suspicious. Every unfamiliar face was a potential threat or a potential reward. Trust became dangerous, and silence became survival. Plantations operated like small kingdoms. The owner's word carried the weight of law, and punishment was swift and brutal. Enslaved people lived knowing that any attempt to escape could end in torture or death, not only for themselves, but for those they left behind. Families were used as leverage, pain as a warning. The system was designed to break the spirit before it ever broke the body. Yet even in such conditions, hope survived, fragile and stubborn, passed in whispers from one person to another, hidden in songs, prayers, and secret glances toward the horizon. At the same time, white society lived inside its own prison, built from fear of rebellion and loss of control. Slave uprisings in earlier decades had left scars on the Southern imagination, turning every rumor into a nightmare. Plantation owners slept with weapons nearby, convinced that violence was always just one step away. Laws tightened, patrols increased, and punishments grew harsher, all in the name of maintaining order. The irony was cruel. The more brutal the system became, the more terrified it was of the very people it oppressed. Religion was often used to justify this world. Sermons preached obedience, order, and divine hierarchy. Passages were twisted to convince the enslaved that suffering was God's will and to reassure owners that their power was righteous. Churches filled every Sunday. Hymns echoed across fields, and prayers were spoken for peace, even as cruelty continued uninterrupted. Faith, which could have been a force for compassion, was frequently turned into another tool of control. In this environment, moral courage was rare. not because people were incapable of it, but because the cost was unimaginably high. To help a runaway slave meant risking everything: reputation, property, family, and life itself. Accusations alone could destroy a person. A whisper of suspicion was enough to invite investigation, violence, or worse. Communities policed themselves ruthlessly, ensuring that anyone who stepped out of line would be isolated and punished. Fear did not need to shout, it simply needed to exist. And yet, despite all of this, the Underground Railroad persisted, not as a single path, but as a fragile network of trust and desperation. It relied on coded messages, secret signals, and people willing to live double lives. For every person who helped, there were dozens who refused, and hundreds who actively hunted those who fled. Success depended on luck as much as bravery. One careless word, one suspicious neighbor, one wrong turn on a dark road could undo everything. Alabama's geography made escape especially difficult. Dense forests, swamps thick with insects and disease, and vast distances between towns turned every journey into a test of endurance. Runaways often traveled at night, guided by stars, moving silently through unfamiliar terrain, while hunger and fear gnawed at them. The land itself seemed determined to betray them, with rivers that flooded without warning and paths that disappeared into darkness. Survival required not just courage, but near superhuman resilience. For those who managed to flee, the fear did not end with escape. Every sound could be a pursuer, every face could be an informer. Sleep was shallow, filled with nightmares of chains and capture. Many were forced to hide in attics, barns, and crawl spaces for days or weeks, barely breathing, waiting for the next move. Freedom was not a single moment of triumph. It was a long, terrifying process filled with uncertainty and sacrifice. Against this backdrop, the idea of hiding not one or two, but dozens of runaway slaves in the heart of the Deep South seems almost impossible. It defies logic, reason, and self-preservation. Such an act would have required extraordinary secrecy, resources, and nerve. It would have meant living every day under the threat of discovery, knowing that one mistake could lead to brutal consequences for everyone involved. In 1850, Alabama, this was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of war against the entire social order. This was the world as it existed before the story truly begins. A world where laws rewarded cruelty, where fear was enforced by violence, and where silence was often the only shield against destruction. It was a time when doing the right thing was not celebrated, but punished, and when moral choices were measured not in words, but in blood. To understand what happened beneath that Alabama plantation, one must first understand how dangerous it was to even consider defiance. Because in a land built on chains, compassion had to hide, courage had to move quietly, and any secret strong enough to challenge the system had to be buried deep, far from prying eyes, waiting for the rare moment when someone was willing to risk everything to protect it. Every decision made during that era carried invisible consequences. A casual conversation at a market, a glance held too long, or a kindness offered at the wrong moment could spiral into tragedy. Information traveled fast, carried by gossip and suspicion, and once a rumor began, it was almost impossible to stop. People learned to mask their thoughts, to present faces that revealed nothing, because curiosity itself could be fatal. In such a climate, secrets were not merely private matters, they were matters of life and death. Children grew up absorbing this fear as something normal. They learned which questions not to ask, and which topics were never discussed at the dinner table. They watched adults lower their voices when certain subjects arose, and noticed how quickly conversations ended when unfamiliar ears were nearby. Even innocence was shaped by caution, and empathy was often trained out of people before it had a chance to grow. The system depended on this quiet conditioning, on teaching each generation to accept cruelty as tradition. Economically, slavery was defended as necessity. Plantations depended on forced labor to produce cotton and other crops that fed global markets. Wealth, status, and power were directly tied to the exploitation of human beings. To challenge slavery was to challenge the very foundation of Southern society, and those who benefited from it were willing to defend it violently. Any threat, no matter how small, was treated as an attack on survival itself, yet history shows that systems built on injustice are always fragile. Beneath the surface of confidence and control, there was constant anxiety. Owners feared revolt. Politicians feared loss of authority. Communities feared being exposed as less loyal than they appeared. This shared insecurity created an atmosphere where overreaction was common and mercy was rare. Violence was not just punishment, it was reassurance, a way of reminding everyone who held power. For enslaved people, this insecurity was visible every day. They saw how quickly anger could erupt and how small mistakes could bring catastrophic consequences. Still, resistance took many forms. Some resisted openly and paid with their lives. Others resisted quietly, preserving their culture, their language, and their sense of self. Escape was the most dangerous form of resistance, but also the most powerful, because it directly challenged the idea that slavery was natural or inevitable. Each successful escape was a crack in the system, proof that control was not absolute. That is why the response was so brutal. Captured runaways were often punished publicly, their suffering turned into a warning for others. Fear was meant to spread faster than hope, yet hope had a way of surviving, passed along by those who dared to imagine a different future, even if they might never live to see it. The presence of northern abolitionists further inflamed tensions. Southern newspapers painted them as monsters and agitators, accusing them of inciting chaos and violence. Any hint of abolitionist sympathy was treated as treason. Letters were opened, travelers questioned, and outsiders watched closely. The South became a place where suspicion replaced hospitality, and kindness toward the wrong person could end a life. In this environment, women were often underestimated, seen as passive figures confined to domestic spaces. This perception created blind spots in a society obsessed with strength and dominance. While men were watched as potential rebels or conspirators, women were frequently dismissed as harmless. That dismissal, however, could become an opportunity, though seizing it required intelligence, restraint, and extraordinary nerve. Any woman who chose to defy the system did so knowing that the consequences would be just as severe, if not more so. Widows occupied a unique position. They were expected to grieve quietly, manage their household, and avoid controversy. Their sorrow made them untouchable in some ways, shielded by social norms that discouraged scrutiny. At the same time, they were isolated, often overlooked, and assumed to be weak. This combination of respect and neglect could become a form of protection, though it was protection that could vanish instantly if suspicion arose. Against this bleak and dangerous backdrop, the stage was set for an act that should not have been possible. Every factor, every law, every social expectation pointed toward silence and obedience. The land itself seemed hostile to escape, and the people were trained to punish compassion. Yet history is shaped not only by systems, but by individuals who decide in moments of quiet clarity that obedience is no longer acceptable. Before any secret rooms were built or lives hidden, there was this world of fear, control, and carefully enforced ignorance. A world where the safest choice was always to look away, and where choosing to see was the most dangerous act of all. It is within this tension, this suffocating atmosphere of risk and repression, that the story truly begins, because only by understanding how impossible defiance was can one grasp the magnitude of what was about to happen beneath that Alabama plantation. Those final years before everything changed were heavy with unspoken dread, as if the land itself sensed a reckoning approaching. People moved, spoke, and lived cautiously, unaware that history often turns not on armies or speeches, but on hidden choices made in silence. In 1850, the South stood balanced between control and collapse, never realizing how close it was to being quietly defied. And that defiance would emerge where no one thought to look, waiting patiently below. In darkness, she was known simply as the Widow, a title that followed her more closely than her real name ever did, and in the rigid social world of the Deep South, that single word carried a strange mixture of respect, pity, and distance. Widowhood placed her in a category that few questioned and fewer understood. She was no longer defined by a husband's authority, yet she was still bound by the expectations of mourning, modesty, and restraint. In a society obsessed with appearances, her grief became a kind of armor, one that shielded her from curiosity and scrutiny in ways she quietly learned to use. After her husband's death, the plantation passed fully into her control. On paper, she was now the owner of land, buildings, and enslaved laborers. a reality that came with power, but also danger. Many assumed she would remarry quickly, that a woman alone could not possibly manage such an estate. But she did not. She remained alone, dressed in black long after social custom required it, moving through her days with deliberate calm. That choice alone unsettled people. A widow who did not seek protection raised questions, but no one asked them aloud. Her days followed a predictable rhythm. She rose early, inspected household matters, and delegated work with quiet efficiency. She did not shout or threaten, which some found unsettling in itself. Cruelty, when expected, is comforting in its predictability. Her restraint made her difficult to read. She attended church faithfully, sitting in the same pew, bowing her head at the right moments, singing hymns in a soft, steady voice. Faith, after all, was a performance as much as it was a belief in the South, and she understood the value of being seen doing what was expected. Neighbors described her as reserved, perhaps even cold. She did not linger in conversation or involve herself in gossip. Invitations were politely declined more often than accepted. When she did attend social gatherings, she spoke little, listened more, and left early, citing fatigue or household responsibilities. Her grief provided an explanation for everything: her silence, her solitude, her distance. People are uncomfortable with sorrow, and most were relieved not to press her beyond polite concern. The plantation itself reflected her personality. It was orderly, quiet, and well maintained, without the excessive displays of wealth favored by some of her peers. There were no lavish parties, no constant stream of visitors. This relative isolation further reduced attention. In a region where social life often revolved around plantation visits and grand dinners, her absence became normal, then unremarkable. Absence, she understood, could be as powerful as presence. She learned quickly how men spoke around her, how their voices softened or became condescending, how they assumed she was fragile, emotional, and dependent. These assumptions worked in her favor. When business matters were discussed, they often explained things unnecessarily, revealing more than they intended. When questions arose about the plantation, answers were accepted without challenge. A widow, after all, was expected to be overwhelmed, not deceptive. Their underestimation became her greatest advantage. Her interactions with the enslaved people on her land were equally calculated, though outwardly unremarkable. She maintained the appearance of distance required of her position, neither overly harsh nor unusually kind. Too much cruelty would invite resentment and resistance. Too much kindness would invite suspicion. She walked a narrow line, understanding that any deviation from the norm could be dangerous. Those who observed her closely might have noticed small inconsistencies, moments when her gaze lingered or her instructions subtly differed, but such moments were easy to dismiss. At night, her house often went dark earlier than others. Lanterns were extinguished, doors locked, and silence settled over the plantation. To outsiders, this was simply the routine of a woman alone, conserving energy and protecting herself. In truth, those quiet nights were essential. Silence was not just a preference, it was a necessity. Every creak of the house, every distant sound carried me. Aining. She learned the language of her surroundings, the way the wind moved through trees, the rhythm of insects, the difference between normal sounds and those that did not belong. Grief had taught her patience. Loss had stripped her life down to essentials, and in doing so, sharpened her awareness. She had learned how quickly the world could change, how permanence was an illusion. This understanding shaped her decisions, making her cautious but resolute. She no longer believed that safety came from obedience alone. Safety, she realized, came from control of information, from knowing when to speak and when to remain invisible. The widow's reputation grew quietly. She was considered respectable, if somewhat distant. No scandals followed her name, no accusations surfaced. This clean image was not accidental. She was meticulous about details, ensuring that nothing about her life invited examination. Financial records were kept in order. Crops were sold on time. Taxes were paid without delay. She gave modest donations to church causes, enough to demonstrate loyalty without drawing attention. Every action reinforced the idea that she was exactly what she appeared to be. Her house became a place people rarely entered without invitation. This too was unusual but acceptable. A grieving woman deserved privacy. Tradesmen and visitors were received in specific rooms, never allowed to wander freely. Certain doors remained closed, explained away as storage or personal space. Boundaries, once established, are rarely challenged, especially when they are framed as matters of propriety. The widow understood how social rules could be used to protect physical spaces. Emotionally, she presented herself as contained, almost restrained. She did not display anger openly, nor did she show excessive warmth. This emotional neutrality made her difficult to provoke and harder to read. Those who interacted with her left, feeling as though they knew her, when in reality they knew nothing at all. She became a mirror, reflecting back whatever was expected of her, while keeping her true thoughts carefully hidden. Behind this composed exterior, however, was a mind constantly calculating risk. Every decision was weighed against potential consequences. She understood the law intimately, not just its words, but its enforcement. She knew which officials were zealous and which were careless, who could be bribed, who could not, and which rumors traveled fastest. Knowledge became her defense. She listened more than she spoke, gathering fragments of information and assembling them into a clearer picture of the dangers around her. Her widowhood also granted her a peculiar freedom. With no husband to answer to, she made decisions independently, though always within the appearance of constraint. Society assumed her choices were limited, but within those limits she found room to maneuver. Expectations became a framework she could hide behind, performing weakness while exercising strength. It was a dangerous balance, but one she maintained with discipline. Time passed, and her continued solitude became a part of her identity. People stopped expecting change. Predictability breeds trust, and trust breeds complacency. The widow became a fixed point in the community, someone who existed without disruption. In a world constantly alert to threats, predictability was disarming. No one looked twice at what never seemed to move. What few realized was that beneath this still surface, she was preparing, not in dramatic gestures or reckless acts, but in careful, incremental steps. Preparation did not announce itself. It blended into routine, disguised as ordinary maintenance, ordinary decisions. Each small choice appeared insignificant on its own, but together they formed a foundation for something extraordinary. She understood that survival depended not on boldness, but on consistency. Her grief never truly left her, but it transformed. It became quieter, sharper, focused. Loss had stripped away illusions about the world's fairness, leaving behind a clarity that few possessed. She no longer believed that morality and law were the same thing. This realization did not make her reckless, it made her precise. She understood that challenging injustice required more than anger. It required patience, discipline, and an ability to live with fear without letting it control her. People who passed her on the road or nodded to her in church never imagined the complexity behind her calm demeanor. They saw a widow managing her estate, surviving as best she could in a harsh world. They did not see the vigilance, the constant awareness, the careful construction of a life designed to avoid attention. They did not see how every assumption they made about her became a tool she could use. The South expected its widows to fade quietly into the background, to exist without ambition or influence. She fulfilled that expectation so perfectly that it rendered her almost invisible. Invisibility, she learned, was a kind of freedom. When no one watches closely, possibilities emerge. When no one expects resistance, resistance can take root unnoticed. Her story, at this stage, contained nothing dramatic, nothing that would attract notice or admiration. That was precisely the point. Great risks cannot be taken openly in a world designed to crush them. They must grow slowly, protected by routine and misunderstanding. The widow's life was a study in restraint, in understanding the power of appearing ordinary. As the years passed, the plantation continued to function smoothly, reinforcing her reputation as a capable, if unremarkable, woman. This reputation would become essential when questions eventually arose, as they always do. Her history of consistency would answer them before she ever needed to speak. People trust patterns more than words. In the quiet spaces between public appearances and private solitude, the widow refined her resolve. She accepted that fear would never disappear, that danger was permanent. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, quietly, without recognition. She was not seeking martyrdom or praise. She was seeking something far more fragile and rare, the preservation of human life in a world determined to erase it. This was the woman the world believed it knew. A grieving widow, respectable and withdrawn, living out her days beneath the southern sun. And because that image was so convincing, because it aligned so perfectly with expectation, no one thought to look deeper. No one imagined that beneath her controlled exterior was a will strong enough to challenge an entire system. They did not see a threat. They saw silence. And in that silence, the foundation for an impossible secret was quietly laid, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. At first, the whispers were so faint that they could be dismissed as imagination, the kind of unease that settles over isolated places once the sun goes down. Plantation life was full of sounds that never fully disappeared, even at night. Wood contracted and expanded, insects sang endlessly, distant animals cried out in the darkness. Yet something felt different. Workers began to notice pauses in the night where silence grew too heavy, followed by sounds that did not belong. A soft scuff where no feet should be. A muted cough quickly swallowed back into stillness. These were not loud enough to confront, but they were persistent enough to unsettle those who heard them. Fear does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives as uncertainty. Those who worked the land knew better than to ask questions. Curiosity was dangerous, especially when it involved the widow's house. The plantation depended on routine, and anything that disrupted that routine invited punishment. Still, people noticed small irregularities. Food stores diminished faster than expected. Water was drawn at unusual hours. Blankets disappeared and reappeared, folded too neatly to be explained by accident. Each detail alone meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern that lingered in the mind. People shared glances, not words, communicating suspicion through silence rather than speech. Nighttime was when the whispers grew strongest. After the last lanterns were extinguished and the fields lay quiet, faint movements could be felt rather than heard. Some described it as vibrations beneath their feet, as if the earth itself were shifting. Others claimed to hear breathing, shallow and controlled, coming from beneath the floorboards of nearby structures. No one stayed long enough to confirm these sensations. Instinct warned them away. In a place where punishment was swift and brutal, survival meant ignoring what could not be explained. The widow herself seemed unchanged, which only deepened the unease. She moved through her days with the same composed restraint, never revealing irritation or concern. Hen spoken to, she answered calmly, her tone measured, her expression neutral. If she noticed anything unusual, she gave no sign. Her lack of reaction made people doubt their own perceptions. Perhaps they were tired. Perhaps fear was playing tricks on them. In a world already saturated with anxiety, it was easier to believe in imagination than in danger. Rumors, however, have a way of forming even when words are never spoken. A glance held too long, a nervous pause, a sudden change in behavior, these were enough to plant seeds of doubt. Some workers avoided certain areas at night, choosing longer routes rather than passing near the house. Others refused to work late, claiming illness or exhaustion. Fear spread quietly, never named, never challenged. It moved like a shadow, present but intangible. Occasionally, an outsider would visit the plantation, and tension would spike instantly. Every unfamiliar voice brought a tightening of nerves. Conversations stopped abruptly. Eyes followed movements more closely. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Those who sensed the whispers feared that strangers might hear them too. The idea that someone else could notice what they had tried so hard to ignore filled them with dread. Discovery, whatever it might mean, felt inevitable and catastrophic. The enslaved people on the plantation lived with a different layer of fear. They understood the cost of secrets better than anyone. For them, rumors were not entertainment, they were threats. If something illegal or dangerous was happening, the consequences would fall hardest on them. Yet even among them, there were those who sensed something unusual. They noticed the widow's subtle signals, the way she avoided certain areas, the moments when her gaze lingered with unspoken meaning. They learned to say nothing, because silence was often the only form of protection they had. As nights passed, the whispers became part of the plantation's rhythm. People adjusted, subconsciously adapting their behavior. Doors were closed more carefully. Footsteps were softened. Tasks were completed earlier in the day. Everyone seemed to sense that something fragile existed, something that could be shattered by noise or attention. No one could have explained it, but everyone felt it. The plantation was no longer just a place of labor and control, it was a place holding its breath. Fear sharpened awareness. Sounds were analyzed instinctively, measured against memory. A familiar creak was dismissed, an unfamiliar one stored away in the mind. People became experts in their environment, knowing every normal sound so well that any deviation stood out immediately. This heightened sensitivity did not bring clarity, only tension. Knowing that something was wrong without knowing what it was created a constant state of unease. The widow's house became the center of these unspoken anxieties. Its closed doors and quiet halls seemed to absorb sound, as if designed to keep secrets. Light flickered briefly at odd hours, then vanished. Smoke rose from chimneys when no fire should have been burning. Each sign was subtle, easily explained away, yet impossible to ignore completely. The house felt alive in a way that unsettled those who noticed. Despite this, daily life continued. Crops were planted, harvested, and sold. Orders were given and followed. Punishments were administered when rules were broken. The system remained intact, its cruelty unchanged. This normalcy made the whispers more disturbing, not less. It suggested that something extraordinary was happening beneath an ordinary surface. The contrast between routine and rumor created a quiet tension that never fully released. Those who sensed the whispers rarely slept deeply. Dreams were filled with half-formed images, with the feeling of being watched or pursued. Waking brought no relief, only the return of controlled behavior and careful silence. The mind learned to exist in two states at once, outward obedience and inward vigilance. This dual existence mirrored the larger reality of the plantation itself, where appearances concealed truths too dangerous to acknowledge. Over time, some convinced themselves that the whispers were warnings, signs that the land was cursed or restless. Superstition offered an explanation that did not require confrontation. Believing in ghosts was safer than believing in resistance. Others suspected something far more dangerous but forced the thought away. In a place where survival depended on not knowing too much, ignorance became a form of self-defense. The widow never addressed the whispers, never denied or acknowledged them. Her silence was absolute. It neither reassured nor threatened. It simply existed, steady and unyielding. That silence shaped the behavior of everyone around her. People mirrored it, adopting the same restraint, the same refusal to question. In this way, her control extended beyond spoken authority into the realm of atmosphere and expectation. As weeks turned into months, the whispers did not disappear. They became woven into the plantation's identity, an invisible layer beneath daily life. They were no longer shocking, only unsettling. People learned to live with them, to step around them mentally, much as they stepped around physical obstacles in the fields. Acceptance did not bring peace, only endurance. What no one could have known then was how close they were to the truth, how the sounds they heard were not echoes or illusions, but proof of something extraordinary hidden in plain sight. The whispers were the faintest evidence of lives held in suspension, of breath controlled and movement restrained by necessity. They were the sound of hope struggling to remain quiet. In a land where noise could kill and silence could save, those whispers existed on the edge between survival and destruction. They were warnings without words, signals without explanation, and though no one dared to investigate, their presence changed everything. The plantation was no longer just a place of enforced order. It had become a place where secrets breathed softly beneath the ground, waiting, enduring, and trusting that silence would continue to protect them. What lay beneath the plantation was not discovered all at once, nor was it created in a single bold act. It emerged slowly, shaped by necessity, patience, and an understanding of how deeply danger was rooted in the land above. Beneath the familiar soil, under floors that creaked with age and weight, existed a hidden world that contradicted everything the plantation represented. It was dark, suffocating, and deliberately concealed, not built for comfort, but for survival. Every inch of it had been planned with one goal in mind: to remain unseen. The space was not a grand tunnel or an obvious cellar that could be stumbled upon by accident. It was fragmented, low, and irregular, carved and reinforced in stages to avoid attention. The ceilings were barely high enough to sit upright, the walls pressed inward, damp and cold, carrying the smell of earth and sweat. Air moved through narrow, carefully disguised vents that blended into natural features above ground. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. From directly above, nothing suggested that human lives existed just feet below. Reaching the refuge required knowledge. Entrances were hidden behind movable panels, beneath heavy furniture, or under layers of soil designed to look undisturbed. Each opening could be sealed quickly, leaving no visible trace. Once closed, they became invisible even to someone actively searching. The design relied not on strength, but on deception. It understood that slave catchers looked for obvious signs, footprints, broken locks, disturbed doors. They did not expect resistance to exist beneath the ground itself. Inside, silence was enforced not by command, but by instinct. Every person who entered understood immediately what was required. Breathing was shallow, movement was slow, even whispers were dangerous. Sound traveled easily in enclosed spaces, and one careless noise could echo upward through wood and earth. The refuge demanded discipline, and those who depended on it learned that discipline quickly, because their lives depended on it. One by one, people arrived. They did not come in groups, because groups attracted attention. They came alone or in pairs, guided by fragmented information and quiet signals. Some arrived barefoot, their feet torn and bleeding from miles of travel. Others carried scars still raw from punishment. A few arrived barely conscious, carried the last distance by hands that shook with exhaustion and fear. Each arrival brought risk, not only to the newcomer, but to everyone already hidden below. There were men who had spent their entire lives in bondage, their backs marked by whips, their eyes hardened by loss. There were women who had fled in desperation, leaving children behind because escape with them would have been impossible. There were also children who had been carried through darkness, taught to remain silent before they could fully understand why. Each person brought a story heavy with pain, but underground those stories were held back, stored in silence, because telling them would cost breath and strength. The widow controlled access with absolute precision. No one entered without her approval, and no one stayed without her knowledge. She decided when it was safe, when it was not, and her judgment was trusted without question. That trust was born not of authority, but of survival. She did not promise safety. She promised effort, planning, and vigilance. That was more than the world above had ever offered. Food was scarce and carefully rationed. Nothing was wasted. Meals were simple, designed to sustain without producing strong smells that could drift upward. Water was carried down in containers that made no noise, drawn at times when activity above would not seem unusual. Waste was managed with equal care, removed in ways that left no trace. Every practical detail became a matter of life and death. The refuge was not just a hiding place, it was a system that required constant attention. Light was limited to the bare minimum. Small shielded lanterns were used sparingly, their flames dimmed to avoid heat and smoke. Most of the time, darkness ruled. People learned to navigate by touch, memorizing the shape of the space, the distance between walls, the location of others. Darkness erased differences. Underground, status and hierarchy dissolved. There were no masters and no slaves, only people bound together by shared danger. Time behaved strangely below the ground. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the widow's signals or the arrival of food. Without sunlight, the body lost its sense of rhythm. Some counted hours in their minds. Others prayed silently, marking time through repetition. Waiting became an act of endurance. The greatest challenge was not hunger or discomfort, but the constant pressure of fear, the knowledge that discovery would be immediate and unforgiving. Above ground, the plantation continued as if nothing existed beneath it. Horses walked over soil that concealed human breath. Guests sat in rooms directly above hidden chambers, laughing, drinking, unaware that every sound they made echoed faintly below. The contrast was cruel and surreal. Life and death coexisted within inches of each other, separated only by wood, dirt, and secrecy. The number grew gradually. At first, there were only a few. Then more arrived, drawn by whispers of a place where capture had not followed escape. Each new arrival increased the risk exponentially. 25 people hidden in one place was not just dangerous, it was nearly impossible. More bodies meant more heat, more need for air, more chances for sound. Every addition forced adjustments, refinements, and new precautions. The widow adapted constantly. She altered schedules, shifted storage, and changed patterns to avoid suspicion. She watched the behavior of neighbors and patrols closely, noting any change that might signal danger. Her mind never rested. Even in sleep she remained alert, waking at the smallest disturbance. Fear became a constant companion, but she did not allow it to dictate her actions. Instead, she used it as a guide, a reminder of what was at stake. The people below learned to trust her completely. Trust was not optional. Doubt created noise, hesitation created mistakes. They followed her instructions, without question, even when it meant enduring long hours of stillness or hunger. Some fought panic silently, pressing hands over mouths to suppress sobs. Others focused inward, retreating into memory or prayer. Survival demanded control, and control demanded sacrifice. There were moments when the refuge felt like a tomb. Air grew heavy, muscles cramped, children trembled with suppressed fear. In those moments, despair threatened to overwhelm hope. Yet even then, something remarkable persisted. A sense of shared purpose, fragile but real, bound them together. They were no longer just individuals fleeing capture. They were witnesses to an act of defiance so quiet it could only exist underground. The space beneath the plantation was never meant to be permanent. It was a pause, a place between bondage and an uncertain future. People stayed only as long as necessary, moving on when it was safe, guided toward other routes, other hiding places. Each departure reduced the number, easing pressure, but it also increased anxiety. Leaving meant exposure, risk, and the possibility of capture. Staying meant suffocation and danger of discovery. Every decision carried consequences. Those who left carried the secret with them, not as a story to be told, but as a weight to be guarded. Speaking of it could doom those who remained. Silence became an obligation, as binding as chains had once been. The refuge depended on silence long after people passed through it. What existed beneath that plantation was not just a hiding place, but a direct contradiction of the world above. Above, laws defined people as property. Below, those same people were protected at unimaginable cost. Above, order was maintained through violence. Below, survival depended on cooperation and restraint. The underground space became a quiet argument against the system that ruled the land. No records documented its existence. No maps marked its location. It lived only through memory and discipline. If discovered, it would have been destroyed immediately, and everyone connected to it punished without mercy. That knowledge shaped every action taken within it. Caution was absolute. Mistakes were unforgivable. Yet despite the fear, despite the darkness, the refuge achieved something extraordinary. It kept people alive in a time when the law demanded their return to suffering. It transformed earth into shelter and silence into resistance. It proved that, even in the heart of oppression, humanity could find ways to survive. The soil above absorbed footsteps, laughter, cruelty, and routine, while beneath it breath was held and hope endured. That hidden space did not announce itself. It did not challenge openly. It simply existed, quietly undermining the certainty of a system built on control. 25 lives passed through that darkness, each one carried by the careful balance of secrecy and courage. They left no trace that could be easily found, no evidence that history could quickly record. What remained was the knowledge that beneath the most ordinary places, extraordinary acts can occur, unseen, unheard, sustained only by resolve. The plantation stood as it always had, its fields stretching toward the horizon, its house upright and respectable. No one looking at it would have guessed what lay beneath. That was the greatest success of the refuge. It did not demand recognition. It demanded only silence, patience, and the willingness to believe that survival, even in the darkest conditions, was worth the risk. The danger reached its most lethal form when the hunters arrived, because fear was no longer abstract or imagined. It took shape in boots on soil, in voices calling out names, in the sharp smell of dogs and gun oil carried by the wind. Slave catchers did not announce themselves politely. They came with authority backed by law, confident in their right to search, question, and destroy. Their presence transformed the plantation instantly. Conversations shortened, movements slowed, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The widow always knew before they reached her door. She read signs others ignored, a change in the behavior of birds, distant shouts carried oddly through the air, the sudden tension that rippled through the enslaved people working the fields. When that tension appeared, her routine shifted with quiet precision. She gave instructions that sounded ordinary but carried deeper meaning. Doors were closed, windows were latched, certain paths were avoided. Above all, silence was enforced without being spoken. Below the ground, the effect was immediate and terrifying. The moment the signal reached them, those hidden beneath the plantation froze, bodies pressed closer to earth, breathing slowed until lungs burned. Children were pulled against chests, mouths covered gently but firmly. Every person understood that this was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that justified every hour of discomfort and fear. Discovery now would mean not just capture, but violent punishment for all involved. The hunters were experienced men. They had chased runaways across forests and rivers, through towns and fields. They believed they could sense guilt, hear lies in hesitation, smell fear on the air. They trusted their instincts more than evidence. That confidence made them dangerous, but it also made them predictable. They expected resistance to look a certain way. They did. And imagine it could exist in absolute stillness beneath their feet. When they reached the house, they were met with calm. The widow did not rush to greet them, nor did she hide. She opened the door herself, dressed in black, her expression composed, her movements unhurried. Grief was still written into her posture, into the way she carried herself. It disarmed them slightly, just enough. A lone widow did not fit their idea of a conspirator. They spoke to her as men accustomed to being obeyed. Questions were framed as statements, requests carried the weight of command. They asked if she had seen strangers, if she had noticed anything unusual, if anyone had passed through recently. Her answers were brief, polite, and perfectly ordinary. She did not over-explain. Over-explanation invites suspicion. She offered exactly what was expected and nothing more. Inside the house, every sound became a potential death sentence. Floorboards creaked as the hunters stepped inside, each step sending vibrations downward. Below, muscles tensed instinctively, bodies fighting the urge to react. A dropped object above sounded like thunder below. Time stretched unbearably. Seconds felt like hours as people counted heartbeats, praying that none would lose control. The hunters moved slowly, deliberately. They examined rooms, peered into corners, tested doors. When they encountered closed spaces, they asked questions. Why was this room locked? Why was that storage sealed? The widow answered calmly, citing propriety, storage, personal grief. She did not argue. She did not resist. Resistance would have invited force. Instead, she relied on expectation. A woman alone guarded her privacy fiercely. That made sense. They accepted it because it fit the story they already believed. Dogs were brought forward next. The animals strained against their handlers, noses low, sniffing for trails. The widow watched without reaction, her face carefully neutral. Below, fear sharpened to a razor's edge. Dogs were unpredictable. They followed scent, not logic. Every breath felt like betrayal. Every bead of sweat felt like evidence. People pressed faces into fabric, willing their bodies to disappear. The handlers circled the yard, the house, the outbuildings. The dogs barked once, then twice, then fell silent. Conflicting scents confused them. The careful measures taken over months, the constant attention to cleanliness and movement, now mattered more than ever. Above ground, the hunters exchanged glances. Confusion crept in. Nothing obvious revealed itself. No broken locks, no footprints, no nervous behavior that exceeded what was normal in such times. Still, suspicion lingered. It always did. One hunter stepped heavily near a section of floor, listening. Another pressed his ear close to the ground outside, as if expecting to hear voices buried in soil. Below, a man's muscles cramped violently, pain shooting through his leg, but he did not move. Teeth were clenched so tightly that blood filled mouths. Endurance became the only form of resistance left. The widow filled the silence carefully. She offered water. She spoke of the heat, of the strain of managing alone, of her desire for peace. These were safe topics, unthreatening, humanizing. The hunters relaxed slightly, their attention drifting. Predators rely on certainty. When certainty fades, urgency fades with it. The widow understood this instinctively. She did not hurry them, but she did not encourage them either. She allowed time to dull their edge. At one point, a hunter laughed, making a crude remark about ghosts hiding under the house. Laughter followed. Jokes were made. Fear momentarily loosened its grip above ground. Below, no one laughed. The sound of it was terrifying. It meant the hunters were comfortable enough to mock the idea of hidden danger. That comfort was fragile, but it was working. The inspection continued, slower now. Rooms were revisited without the same intensity. Questions repeated themselves, but with less force. The widow's answers never changed. Consistency is more convincing than cleverness. Eventually, boredom set in. Slave hunting was work, and work lost its thrill when it produced nothing. They wanted results, not endless searching. Before leaving, the leader turned back, his gaze lingering on the widow a moment longer than necessary. It was not suspicion so much as calculation. He was weighing the effort of continued scrutiny against the likelihood of reward. In the end, convenience won. There were other plantations, other leads, other rumors more promising than a silent widow and her orderly home. When they finally mounted their horses and rode away, relief did not come immediately. It never did. Experience had taught everyone that danger rarely announced its end. The widow waited until the sound of hooves faded completely before allowing herself to breathe deeply. Even then, her composure did not break. She returned to her routine as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Below ground, people remained frozen long after it was safe. Muscles shook uncontrollably once movement was allowed. Silent tears flowed, released without sound. Children were held tightly, reassured through touch alone. Survival had demanded everything they had, and it had taken its toll. Relief mingled with terror, because they knew this would not be the last time. These visits repeated themselves over months. Each time the danger felt sharper, the margin for error thinner. Patterns were studied and adjusted. The widow learned which hunters were most aggressive, which were lazy, which were easily distracted. She adapted her responses accordingly. The refuge below adapted as well, refining silence into an art. Above and below became two stages of the same performance. Above, calm normalcy. Below, disciplined stillness. The success of one depended entirely on the perfection of the other. Any failure would collapse both. This balance was exhausting, mentally and physically. It demanded constant vigilance from everyone involved, yet with each successful deception, confidence grew cautiously. Not arrogance, but trust in the system they had built. They learned that even the most brutal forces could be misled by patience and restraint. They learned that power, when it relies on assumptions, can be quietly undermined. The hunters never realized how close they came. They never knew how many lives were held beneath them as they spoke and laughed. That ignorance was the greatest weapon the widow possessed. She did not defeat them through confrontation, but through invisibility. Each departure reinforced a dangerous truth. The refuge worked, silence worked, and as long as it worked, the risk was worth taking. But no one forgot that a single mistake would end everything. Success did not erase fear. It sharpened it, because now there was something precious to lose. The game continued, deadly and quiet, played out in glances, pauses, and controlled breaths. Above ground, authority believed itself unchallenged. Below ground, resistance survived by refusing to be seen. And in the space between those two realities, the widow stood as the fragile bridge, holding everything together through calm, calculation, and an understanding that survival often depends not on strength, but on the ability to appear harmless until danger passes. The question that lingered long after the danger passed was never how she did it, but why. Why would a woman surrounded by comfort, status, and legal protection choose to risk everything for people the law had declared property? The widow never explained herself openly, and perhaps she never would have, even if asked directly. In a world where words could be used as weapons, silence was safer than confession. Yet motives, like secrets, have a way of revealing themselves through patterns, choices, and quiet consistency. Some believed her reasons were rooted in guilt, inherited and unresolved. The plantation, like many others, had been built on suffering long before it came into her possession. Generations of wealth often carried generations of blood with them, and perhaps she felt the weight of that history pressing down on her. It is possible that she looked at the land and saw not prosperity, but the cost at which it was bought. For some, awareness of injustice creates paralysis. For others, it creates obligation. She may have felt that doing nothing was no longer an option once she truly understood what doing nothing meant. Others suspected loss shaped her choices more deeply than guilt ever could. Grief has a way of stripping away illusions, of revealing what truly matters when everything else falls apart. Losing her husband may have shown her how fragile life was, how quickly security could vanish. In that understanding, she may have seen reflected the daily reality of those enslaved around her, people who lived with loss as a constant companion. Compassion often grows from shared vulnerability, even when circumstances differ greatly. There were whispers that she had lost a child, though no record confirmed it. Such a loss would explain the particular care she showed toward the youngest among those hidden below. Children make injustice impossible to ignore. They do not fit neatly into arguments about economics or law. They expose cruelty for what it is. If she had once held a child and imagined a future for them, perhaps she could not watch other children be denied even the chance to live freely. Religion, too, may have played a role, though not in the way sermons often preached. Faith, when stripped of doctrine and hierarchy, can become a simple question of conscience. If one truly believes that all lives are created with equal worth, then the system surrounding her was a direct contradiction of that belief. She attended church, listened to hymns about love and mercy, and then returned home to a world that practiced neither. The tension between belief and reality can become unbearable when ignored long enough. Yet it is also possible that her reasons were not rooted in emotion at all, but in clarity. She may have simply seen the system for what it was and decided it was wrong. Not everyone who resists injustice does so because of personal tragedy or religious conviction. Some do it because they refuse to accept lies as truth. The idea that certain people were born to be owned required constant reinforcement. Once that idea cracked, even slightly, the entire structure became absurd. Her position gave her a rare perspective. She existed inside the system, but was not fully bound by it. Widowhood removed one layer of control while preserving another layer of protection. She could see both the privileges she possessed and the violence that sustained them. That vantage point may have made neutrality impossible. When one can see both sides clearly, choosing to do nothing becomes a decision in itself, one that carries its own moral weight. It is important to understand that helping did not come without internal conflict. Fear was ever present. She understood the consequences better than most. Discovery would have meant not only her death or imprisonment, but brutal punishment for those she hid. Every choice carried the possibility of catastrophic failure. Courage in this context was not a single moment of bravery, but a daily commitment to live with terror and continue anyway. She did not romanticize what she was doing. There were no illusions of heroism. The underground refuge was not a place of triumph, but of endurance. It was dirty, cramped, and frightening. People suffered there. She suffered too, in a different way. She lived with constant anxiety, knowing that her actions could end lives if she miscalculated. This was not kindness in its simplest form. It was responsibility taken to an extreme. Some might argue that she was driven by a desire for control, that creating the refuge allowed her to assert power in a war that otherwise limited her. But this interpretation fails to account for the nature of her actions. Control usually seeks visibility and validation. What she built depended on invisibility and anonymity. She gained nothing tangible from it. If anything, she gave up peace of mind, safety, and any chance of a quiet life. Others suggested that she acted because she could. Opportunity is a powerful motivator. She had land, resources, and a position that allowed her to move without scrutiny. Many people might have felt sympathy for runaways, but few had the means to help. Having the ability to intervene can create a sense of obligation. When one knows that survival is possible through one's own choices, refusing to act can feel like direct complicity. Perhaps her motivation was not a single reason, but a convergence of many. Guilt, grief, faith, clarity, opportunity, and defiance may have all played their part. Human decisions are rarely simple, especially when they involve risking everything. What mattered was not which reason dominated, but that together they outweighed fear. There is also the possibility that she never framed her actions in moral terms at all. She may have seen people in need and responded instinctively without philosophy or justification. Sometimes the most radical acts come from refusing to intellectualize cruelty. When faced with suffering, she may have simply chosen to reduce it where she could. In a world obsessed with justification, such simplicity is revolutionary. Her silence about her motives ensured that history would struggle to define her. Without written confessions or public statements, she became a figure shaped by speculation. This ambiguity protected her during her life and complicated her legacy after death. It forced others to confront uncomfortable questions about their own choices. If her reasons were unclear, then excuses for inaction became harder to defend. What is clear is that she understood the humanity of those she helped in a way that transcended social roles. Underground, distinctions dissolved. People were not slaves, owners, men, women, or children in the eyes of the law. They were breathing bodies trying to survive. That recognition alone was enough to dismantle the moral framework of slavery. Once one sees another person fully, ownership becomes impossible to justify. She did not seek to dismantle the system openly. She did not write pamphlets or give speeches. Her resistance was quiet, almost invisible. In some ways, this made it more powerful. Open rebellion invites suppression. Quiet defiance erodes certainty. Each person she helped escape was a contradiction the system could not explain away. Each life saved was proof that the rules were not absolute. Her actions also challenged the idea that resistance required numbers or force. She acted largely alone, relying on secrecy rather than solidarity. This does not diminish collective struggle, but it expands the definition of resistance. It shows that even within rigid systems, individuals can carve out spaces of humanity if they are willing to endure isolation and fear. The cost of her choice followed her constantly. She could not share the burden of her decision openly. She carried it alone, presenting a calm exterior while managing chaos beneath it. This isolation may have been one of the heaviest prices she paid. Acts of kindness are often imagined as uplifting, but when they must be hidden, they become heavy with loneliness. Still, she persisted. That persistence suggests that whatever her reasons, they were strong enough to sustain her through repeated danger. Motivation rooted in impulse fades quickly under pressure. Motivation rooted in conviction, however complex, endures. She adjusted, learned, and continued, even when fear intensified. In the end, perhaps the most honest answer to why she did it is simply that she refused to accept the world as it was. She saw a gap between what was legal and what was right, and she chose to stand in that gap no matter how narrow or dangerous it was. She did not expect to change the system. She chose to protect lives within it. Her story reminds us that moral courage does not always announce itself with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it looks like silence, routine, and restraint. Sometimes it looks like a widow in black, moving through her days unnoticed, while beneath her feet, humanity survives against all odds. The question of why she did it remains unanswered because it must. If her motives were clear and simple, they could be dismissed as exceptional, unattainable. Ambiguity forces reflection. It asks whether others, placed in similar circumstances, might have found their own reasons to act. In a world that punished compassion, she practiced it anyway. In a system that rewarded obedience, she chose quiet defiance. Whatever combination of reasons drove her, the result was the same. 25 people lived because she decided that fear would not be her final authority, and that decision, more than any explanation, defines who she was. The night everything nearly collapsed did not announce itself with urgency or chaos. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine, the most dangerous form it could take. The air was thick and still, heavy with heat that pressed against skin and slowed breath. Insects droned endlessly, their sound so constant it became part of the silence. Above ground, the plantation appeared unchanged, resting beneath the moon as it had countless nights before. Below, tension had already begun to coil, tight and restless, long before anyone understood why. The first sign was subtle. A child shifted too suddenly in the dark, startled awake by a dream that carried echoes of chains and shouting. Small hands clenched instinctively, pulling fabric tight. A breath escaped, sharper than intended, quickly swallowed, but not before it traveled. Sound behaves differently underground. It stretches, bounces, searches, every. One froze, muscles locked, Hearts thundered. Fear surged so fast it felt physical, like a blow to the chest. Above them, footsteps approached. They were not hurried. They never were. The most terrifying thing about slave catchers was their patience. They walked as men who knew time was on their side. Boots crossed wooden floors, each step deliberate, testing. The widow stood in her place, posture calm, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. She had no warning this time, no distant signs, no ripple through the fields. They were simply there. Voices followed the footsteps, low, confident, familiar in their cruelty. They spoke of rumors, of sightings, of information that had come too close for comfort. Someone had talked. Someone had noticed something they should not have. The words drifted downward through wood and earth, each one slicing deeper than the last. Below, people pressed themselves into the ground as if they could merge with it. The space felt smaller, the air thicker. Panic threatened to rise, but panic made noise, and noise meant death. Hands reached out in the dark, finding shoulders, arms, backs. Touch became language. Stay still, stay quiet, live. The widow answered questions above with the same controlled precision she always used. But tonight, the balance felt different. The hunters were more alert, less amused. Their movements sharper. They had come expecting something. That expectation made them dangerous. Then came the sound that nearly ended everything. A floorboard shifted. It was slight, almost nothing, the kind of sound that happened every day in old houses. But context turned it lethal. One of the hunters stopped mid-step. Silence followed, abrupt and absolute. Even the insects seemed to pause. Below, a man's breath hitched involuntarily. Pain shot through his chest as he forced it back down, lungs burning. A woman clenched her jaw so hard her teeth cracked slightly. The child's eyes were wide, unblinking, learning in that moment what silence truly meant. Above, the hunter bent slowly, placing a hand against the floor. He listened. Time fractured. Seconds stretched into eternity. Sweat slid down faces underground, each drop feeling like betrayal. Muscles screamed from stillness. No one moved. No one dared. The widow felt it too. The shift, the moment when control teetered. She did not rush to fill the silence. That would have been a mistake. Instead, she allowed it to exist, meeting it with stillness of her own. Fear recognized fear. It passed between them without words. Another hunter laughed softly, the sound forced, uncertain. He made a joke about old houses and restless wood. The laugh that followed was thin, unconvincing. Suspicion had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. They decided to search again. The sound of furniture moving sent shockwaves below. Every scrape echoed like thunder. One wrong motion underground, one involuntary response, and everything would be over. The widow's calm never broke. She guided them subtly, steering attention where it was safest, offering access where it revealed nothing. Then came the child again. A tremor ran through the small body, too much fear held too long. A whimper rose, tiny and desperate, before a hand sealed it away. But sound, once released, cannot be undone. It lingered, faint but real. Above, every head turned. The leader's expression hardened. He raised a hand, signaling silence. His eyes scanned the room, calculating, narrowing. He had heard something. He was certain of it. Below, the world stopped. Breath ceased entirely. Hearts pounded so violently it felt impossible they could not be heard. The child was pressed into a chest, held so tightly it bordered on pain. Tears fell silently, soaking fabric, leaving dark stains no one could see. The hunter crouched again, closer this time. He pressed his ear to the floor. In that moment, survival balanced on something smaller than courage or planning. It balanced on chance, on timing, on the mercy of distraction. A dog barked outside, sharp, loud. Urgent, the sound cut through the tension like a blade. The hunter swore under his breath, rising quickly. Orders were shouted. The moment fractured. Attention shifted outward, pulled by instinct and irritation. The floor was forgotten. Below, people did not move. They did not breathe. Relief was a dangerous emotion. It made bodies weak. It made sounds escape. They held on, suspended between terror and hope, until footsteps retreated, voices faded, and the house settled again. Even then, no one spoke. No one cried. Survival had not yet been confirmed. Minutes passed, then more. The widow moved carefully above, maintaining routine, offering nothing that suggested alarm. Only when the sounds of horses finally faded into the distance did she allow herself to lean briefly against the wall, closing her eyes for a single breath. Below, motion returned in fragments. A hand loosened. A shoulder relaxed. Silent sobs shook bodies that had been forced into stillness too long. Pain erupted as muscles released. The child was held, rocked gently, reassurance given without sound. They had survived by seconds. That night changed everything. After it, silence became stricter, rules tightened, time underground was shortened whenever possible, risks were recalculated, the widow altered patterns more aggressively, aware now of how close they had come. The people below carried the memory like a scar, invisible but permanent. Sleep became harder. Every sound replayed in the mind. Every memory returned with new intensity. Survival did not erase fear, it deepened it, but something else survived too, resolve. They had come to the edge and not fallen. They had faced discovery and endured. That knowledge changed them. Fear remained, but it was joined by a quiet understanding of their own strength. The system had almost crushed them, but it had failed. The night of the near collapse became unspoken law. No one referenced it directly, but everyone remembered. It shaped every movement, every breath taken underground afterward. It was the moment when the secret proved how fragile it truly was, and how fiercely it was being protected. Above ground, life resumed its cruel normalcy. The hunters moved on, chasing other rumors, leaving behind no sign of how close they had come to uncovering something extraordinary. They never knew how near they were to rewriting lives forever. Below ground, people continued to wait, to endure, to trust. The plantation stood unchanged in the daylight, peaceful and silent. No one passing by would have guessed that beneath it, human lives had once been suspended by a single sound, a single breath, a single bark in the distance. That night did not end the danger. It clarified it, and everyone who lived through it understood something they would never forget. Survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is holding your breath in the dark, trusting that silence will be enough. When the widow died, the plantation did not mourn her in any grand or meaningful way. There were no speeches that captured the weight of what she had done, no public recognition of courage or sacrifice. Her death passed through the community the way her life had, quietly, respectfully, and without curiosity. People spoke of her as a reserved woman who had lived alone for too long, who had managed her estate competently and kept to herself. That version of her was easy to accept. It required no rethinking of the world they lived in. The house was emptied slowly, furniture was sold, personal belongings were divided or discarded, rooms that had once held careful silence were opened to light and air without ceremony, floors were scrubbed, walls were repainted. What had been deliberately hidden was covered over again, this time by forgetfulness rather than secrecy. The underground refuge, once vital and alive with restrained breath, was sealed completely. Entrances were closed, concealed beneath permanent fixtures or layers of earth that would never be disturbed intentionally again. Those who came to claim the land saw only opportunity. To them, the plantation was property, nothing more. Soil to be worked, buildings to be used, profit to be extracted. They walked the same ground where fear had once ruled inches below their boots, unaware of the lives that had been protected there. Their ignorance was total, and in a way, it was the final layer of protection the widow had provided. Secrets survive longest when no one thinks to look for them. The people who had passed through the refuge did not return. They could not. Returning would risk exposure, not only for themselves, but for anyone connected to the place. They carried the memory with them as something sacred and dangerous, locked away in silence. Some likely lived long lives, others may not have. History does not preserve their names or fates. What remains is the fact that they lived beyond the moment because someone chose to protect them. With time, even whispers faded. New generations worked the land, unaware of its past. Stories were not passed down because there was no safe way to pass them. The South moved forward into war, reconstruction and change, but it did so without acknowledging the quiet defiance that had existed within it all along. Loud history recorded battles, laws, and leaders. Quiet history remained buried, preserved only in the earth and in the memories of those who never spoke. The widow left no written confession, No diary surfaced to explain her choices. No letters revealed her thoughts. This absence frustrated later historians who searched for clarity and motive. But perhaps that absence was intentional. Words can be twisted. Records can be seized. Silence, when chosen carefully, can be more enduring than ink. By leaving no explanation, she denied the world the ability to simplify her actions. In death, as in life, she remained partially unknowable. That unknowability became part of her legacy. Without a clear narrative, she could not be easily categorized as saint or traitor. She existed in a space that demanded reflection rather than judgment. Those who later stumbled upon fragments of the story were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, courage, and responsibility. The sealed refuge became part of the land, its materials decaying slowly, returning to earth. Wood rotted, supports weakened. Eventually, even its shape would have softened, leaving only subtle changes in the soil that no one would recognize as significant. Nature reclaimed the space, indifferent to the fear and hope it had once held. This quiet erasure mirrored how society often treats acts of hidden courage, allowing them to disappear because they challenge comforting narratives. Yet absence does not equal insignificance. The impact of the widow's actions extended far beyond the physical space she created. Each person who survived carried that survival forward, influencing lives that followed. Children were born who would not have existed otherwise. Choices were made because freedom allowed them. The ripple effects were invisible, but real, woven into futures no one could trace back to that plantation. The widow herself became a ghost of a different kind, not haunting rooms or fields, but haunting history's blind spots. She represented all those whose resistance never made headlines, whose courage operated in shadows rather than on stages. Her story challenged the idea that change only comes from mass movements or celebrated figures. It suggested that individual choices, made quietly and sustained over time, can be just as transformative. As years passed, the South constructed new myths about itself. Stories of honor, tradition, and resilience took center stage, often at the expense of truth. The brutality of slavery was softened or justified. Acts of defiance that did not fit preferred narratives were ignored. Intish is rewriting. The widow's secret had no place. It complicated too much. It implied that alternatives had always existed, that people could have chosen differently. For those who eventually uncovered hints of what had happened, the discovery was unsettling. It forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about the past. It asked whether evil systems persist because they are unstoppable or because too many people accept them. The widow's actions suggested that even in the heart of oppression, space existed for resistance, if one was willing to endure the cost. Her story also reframed the idea of heroism. There were no dramatic escapes witnessed by crowds, no declarations made in public squares. There was only preparation, patience, and fear managed through discipline. Heroism here was not loud or affirming. It was exhausting, isolating, and deeply uncertain. It required living every day, knowing that discovery would mean death. The people she protected never erected monuments to her. They could not. Gratitude had to remain private. In that way, her reward was never recognition, but survival itself. That may have been enough for her. The absence of acknowledgement preserved the purity of her choice. She did not act to be remembered. She acted because she believed it was necessary. Even today, stories like hers are often met with skepticism. They seem too improbable, too dangerous to have occurred unnoticed. Yet history is full of such improbabilities. It is shaped not only by what is recorded, but by what is hidden successfully. Survival stories are often invisible precisely because survival required invisibility. The sealed refuge stands as a symbol of that truth. It existed because it was not seen. It functioned because it did not announce itself. It succeeded because silence was maintained absolutely. In a world that equates power with visibility, this kind of success is difficult to recognize, but no less real. The widow's death closed the final chapter of The Secret, but it did not erase its meaning. Meaning does not depend on witnesses. It depends on impact. 25 lives protected in a time of sanctioned cruelty is not a footnote. It is a quiet indictment of a system that claimed total control and failed. The land above eventually forgot what it had sheltered. But forgetting is not the same as absolution. The past does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It remains layered beneath the present, influencing it in ways that are not always understood. The soil holds memory, even when people do not. The widow's story reminds us that history is incomplete by nature. For every act recorded, countless others are lost to silence. This does not diminish them. It challenges us to look beyond official narratives, to consider what might have happened in the shadows, sustained by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Her legacy is not one of perfection or purity. She operated within a system she benefited from, even as she undermined it. That contradiction makes her story more human, not less. It forces us to confront the complexity of moral action in unjust systems. It asks whether partial resistance is still resistance, whether saving some lives matters if one cannot save all. The answer, implicit in her actions, is yes. Saving lives matters, even when it is not enough. Courage matters, even when it does not change the world overnight. Silence can matter when it is used not to enable cruelty, but to protect humanity. As time continues to move forward, the widow's secret serves as a reminder that the past is not as simple as it is often presented. Beneath familiar stories lie deeper truths, waiting for someone to question, to dig, to listen for what was never meant to be heard. Her story ends not with triumph, but with quiet continuity. The plantation changed hands, the land endured, life moved on. But somewhere, in ways no record can fully capture, the choice she made continued to matter, because history is not only written by those who speak loudly. Sometimes it is shaped by those who choose to remain silent, and in that silence, keep others alive. If this story made you pause, if it made you feel uneasy, then its secret still works. Like the video, subscribe and tell me, should stories like this stay buried or be remembered? Because the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting to be uncovered,